So after going through that dreck that was Mortal Kombat 4 on the Game Boy Color, a game that hopefully I won't have to mention any more about unless I review Mortal Kombat Advance somewhere down the line, I decided to go back and review a game from my childhood. The game I'll be talking about today is Capcom VS SNK Pro on the PS1. I played this game for hours and hours on end back when I was around 9 to 11. A guy my mother was dating at the time had a box full of PS1 and 2 games, and this was one of the games he had in his collection, along with Lunar Silver Star Story Complete, which is one of my favorite games on the system, Dragon Warrior 7, Final Fantasy Tactics, and an obscure tactical RPG by Atlas under the name of Cardia: The World of Fate, followed by PS2 games like Champions of Norath, Hotshots Golf 4, and EverQuest Online Adventures, which I only got to experience twice in my life since I was rather young during the time of the game was big, and I didn't understand online gaming yet. Nowadays I have no way to play it unless I hook it up to a third-party server, but who knows if I'm ever going to be able to do that.
It might happen. Yeah, and monkeys might fly out of my butt.
I'm getting off track. At this point in time, I didn't get to play fighting games a whole lot as a kid, simply because hardly anyone in the house cared about the genre. Everyone in the household at the time played games, myself, my mother, and my sister. But I'll never forget those moments I spent playing games with my family, whether it was racing games with my father like Gran Turismo 3 and ATV Off-Road Fury, or playing games like Tetris Worlds and Hotshots Golf 4 with my mom, or even playing Pikmin 2, Mario Kart Double Dash, and Super Smash Bros. Melee with my sis. Love you guys. But because no one in my family was really into fighting games, my selection was very limited, and having a job was out of the question being a little kid and all. I did play a few of them at the time, but I never had a lot of access to most of those games, and the only fighting games I actually had were Tekken 3, Mortal Kombat on Super Nintendo, and the aforementioned Super Smash Bros. Melee. Capcom vs SNK didn't really belong to me, as it belonged to my mom's boyfriend at the time. It wasn't until January of 2007, at the age of 11, I finally bought a fighting game of my very own, and that game would be Dragon Ball GT Final Bout on PS1. I remember liking it a lot as a kid despite not knowing how to do the special moves, and always getting my ass handed to me because of the damn meteor attacks. But the older I became, the more I realized this game hadn't really aged well at all. It's marked by sluggish gameplay, unresponsive controls, and moves that are almost impossible to pull off. As such, my start on purchasing my own fighting games didn't get off to a great start in hindsight. It wouldn't be until around late 2007 where I purchased a brand spanking new copy of King of Fighters 2006 on the PS2. Why am I telling you all this? Well, it's because Capcom vs SNK was one of my biggest ventures into fighting games, at a time where I didn't have access to them like I do now. I didn't particularly own the game myself, but I played the hell out of it for hours on end and loved it. Even my sister played it sometimes, and she doesn't really like fighting games that much. At this point in time, I also had heard about the game's sequel, Capcom vs SNK 2, which I really wanted for the longest time, but I never got it until around 2013, when I downloaded it from the PlayStation Store on my PS3. After I was no longer able to play the game due to changes in life that I won't go into detail about, I was still hopeful that one day I would play the game again, and eventually I got a PS1 emulator working, finally getting to play it again, but it wasn't quite the same. Something was still missing. It just felt so much better to play on a real console, and then I finally got my chance and purchased myself a copy. I don't usually buy my games complete, but PS1 games are one of my few exceptions, because the artwork is on the manual itself, and without the manual, the case sticks out like a sore thumb, and the feeling of it being incomplete is rather obvious. With just about everything else, I don't really care so long as I have the case and the game, or if it's a card, I'm fine with having just the cart. The casing is simply optional, although Sega Genesis cases are pretty nice. Anyways, now that I've covered a little bit of my history with the game, let's dive right in to Capcom vs SNK on the PS1 and see how it holds up today. Now, some of you may be asking, what is so pro about it? Well, I'll provide a little bit of context here. The game was originally just released as Capcom vs SNK with the subtitle Millennium Fight 2000. The game was originally released in the arcades the aforementioned year, and then got released for the Dreamcast in September of the same year in Japan, and November in North America. A year later, in 2001, the game received an update in the arcades, which is the Pro release. This version introduced two new characters to the roster, Dan Hibiki from Street Fighter Alpha and Joe Higashi from Fatal Fury. added some new play modes, and rebalanced the gameplay to make it more fair. Like the original version, it received a Dreamcast port the same year, but unlike the original, the Dreamcast version of Pro did not get a North American release, instead being Japan only. However, the game would still see a North American release, not on Dreamcast, but instead on the PS1 in August of 2002, making it a pretty late release in the system's life cycle. I think this was a bit of a strange choice considering Capcom vs SNK 2 was already out on the PS2 back in 2001, so the fact that the original game was released a year after its sequel on inferior hardware mystifies me. Even though it's a strange port, I did find myself enjoying the game. Now, there's no point in talking about the game's story because it isn't integral to the game anyway. The game starts you up with 30 characters to choose from, with 5 characters being unlockable, giving a total of 35, including EX characters, which are their own separate entities. More on them later. You unlock these characters by purchasing them with the game's currency known as Versus Points. A strange thing to call game currency, but I digress. As the name suggests, you have a mix of characters from different Capcom and SNK franchises, although the majority of them are from the Street Fighter and King of Fighters series, with the Capcom side consisting almost exclusively of Street Fighter characters, except for Morgan Ainsland from Darkstalkers. I'm not really sure why Capcom didn't diversify their list a little bit. I understand the 12 characters from Street Fighter 2 are important to the series, but it wouldn't have hurt to add in some characters from games like Mega Man, Final Fight, Resident Evil, Ghouls and Ghosts, Strider, Cyberbots, or even Saturday Night Slam Masters. I'd love to see that. They did broaden things up a little bit in Capcom vs SNK 2, adding a couple of characters from rival schools and the aforementioned Final Fight to the mix, and the roster there is significantly better, but even with most of the cast being Street Fighter characters, there are still plenty from other games in the series, like Street Fighter Alpha for instance. The SNK cast is a bit more diverse, containing characters from not only King of Fighters, but also Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, and Samurai Showdown. However, most of the characters are from the KOF series, so while there is slightly more diversity in the cast, it's not much better than the Capcom roster. Despite the lack of diversity in the roster, this isn't a bad cast of characters. Most of the characters have very different fighting styles from one another and come with their own set of moves at their disposal. There are some similarities between a couple of characters like Ryu and Ken, but for the most part, it keeps each character fresh and unique. On the Capcom side, you've got characters like Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, Cammy, Dhalsim, Blanka, Sakura, Morrigan, and more. On the SNK side, you've got Terry, Kyo, Iori, Geese, Rugal, Yamazaki, Yuri, Ryo, and more. Now with that, there is also the groove system, which is important to the way you play the game. The differences are subtle but effective. You have a choice between 2 different grooves here, which are the Capcom and SNK grooves. The Capcom groove runs on a level 3 gauge system similar to the Street Fighter Alpha series. I tend to use this one the most because it's easier for me to manage. The SNK groove allows you to pump up your gauge at any time, similar to King of Fighters 94 all the way to 98, but be very careful when you do that because filling up your gauge is risky in this regard, as it will leave you open for attack. It gives off a bit of a risk versus reward vibe. Selecting your characters in the game is a bit different from the usual fighting game fare, as it uses a ratio system in which the ratio number determines the character's strength. There are 4 ratios in total, with 1 being the weakest and 4 being the strongest. When you choose a character, the choices available to you will become a bit more limited, as the ratio system only has 4 available slots. So if you choose a ratio 2 character like Ryu or Kyo, you can't pick a ratio 3 or 4 character because it will go over the limit. You will have to either choose another ratio 2 character or a ratio 1 character. I found this system a bit strange when I first played it because it felt very restrictive to me, but the older I got, the more I started to understand it, and it does keep things fairly regulated, allowing you to choose carefully. The modes in this game are par for the course for a fighting game. You've got your standard arcade and versus modes, but you also have a unique mode called pair match mode, where you can choose 2 characters regardless of their ratio because all of them are set to ratio 2. You would think that something like this would cause the game to be completely broken, but surprisingly, it isn't. Because all the ratios have been moved to 2, it does keep things balanced out for the most part, but not for the ratio 4 characters, as they are rather broken and you can easily breeze through the game just by playing as them. There is also a color edit mode where you can customize the character's colors to your liking, a training mode which is very helpful if you want to learn the game's controls, and there's a price mode which allows you to unlock new characters. Before I move on to the gameplay and the controls, I would like to briefly mention the EX characters. Remember when I said they are their own separate entities? Well, that's because there are 2 versions of Ryu and Iori you can play as, respectively, and they're not just mere palette swaps either. They have their own separate victory and introductory quotes that are a bit stronger and a hell of a lot faster than their original counterparts. In Iori's case, his fighting stance is very different, as he's all hunched over looking like a derp, but that's a part of his character, as EX Iori is actually called Orochi Iori, whom is a much more psychotic and insane version of his original counterpart. His quotes kind of make him sound like he's either taking a shit or he's just getting out of bed. Whichever it is, I couldn't take him seriously. EX Ryu, aka Evil Ryu, on the other hand, is much more menacing, proving to be a legit threat and a force to be reckoned with. There aren't as many differences to this version of Ryu, but what is here indeed sets him apart from his original version. Moving on, the gameplay feels very similar to the Street Fighter Alpha series, which isn't a bad thing, as I prefer this kind of style of gameplay. Surprisingly enough, it also works pretty well for the SNK characters. Now, of course, they had to be reworked in order to work with that style of gameplay the game was going for, but even with all these reworkings and button mappings, I think Capcom did a fairly solid job here. The gameplay is fast and frantic, never letting up on the action, and it runs pretty smoothly for a PS1 game. Now keep in mind, this is a port of a Dreamcast game, but even with the inferior hardware, the frame rate rarely ever drops, and even when it does, the drop only occurs during brief segments like dishing out a super move to finish off your opponent, which doesn't hinder gameplay at all. The controls are very snappy and responsive, never feeling too awkward or clunky. While I wouldn't say this is the best controlling 2D fighter, it works well for what it's trying to accomplish. All the special moves work the way they are supposed to, and it is incredibly satisfying to pull off the super moves. Some of them are pretty easy to activate, while others are trickier due to the more complex button combinations. This may turn off casual fighting game players, but to other fans of the genre, they'll feel rewarded pulling them off. I have to say, it's pretty satisfying to pull off the super moves on your opponent, especially when you finish him off and it leads to a pretty epic animation sequence. The graphics for a 2D game on PS1 are pretty good, all things considered. Not quite up to the level of Symphony of the Night, but still solid work for a PS1 game released in 2002. The sprite work is nice, reminiscent of Street Fighter Alpha 3, and even the SNK characters look quite nice. To some, people may find it weird to see the SNK characters drawn in this art style, but I played this game before I even knew what Street Fighter or King of Fighters was, though I was familiar with Capcom at the time I first started, as I had a few of their SNES outings back then, so this art style difference didn't really bother me. In my opinion, the art style works to its advantage, leaving room for some fairly smooth animation. The artwork of the characters is pretty nice too. An interesting thing about it is that every character is drawn in both the Capcom and SNK styles. Most of them look pretty decent on both sides, but some pieces of artwork look better than others in my opinion. Of course, considering this is a PS1 port, it doesn't have as many frames of animation as the Dreamcast version, so it doesn't look quite as smooth. But unlike that clumsy PS1 port of Marvel vs. Capcom, they didn't cut out as many frames this time. PS1 ports of 2D fighters tend to get a bad rep for being truncated versions of their arcade counterparts, and while this version is truncated as well, it's not as bad as one might think. Everything moves like it's supposed to, keeping the important animations while taking out unnecessary ones. Sure, it doesn't look as good, and it's missing a lot of the graphical pizzazz that the Dreamcast version has, like the dynamic visual effects, but for a PS1 game, it's not half bad, all things considered. The stage backdrops all fit well within the game, and while they don't share a ton of animation, they are nice to look at, and they all share different themes, even some being recreated versions of old stages from years past, like Pow Pow Cafe and the Geese Tower from Fatal Fury, for instance. The only downside is that there is a fair amount of pixelation, which makes some of the images look very jagged due to the lower resolution, but that's to be expected for a PS1 game. For the most part, the audio quality is pretty good. The music is pretty solid, featuring an eclectic mix of techno, trance, hip-hop, rock, and other genres. Some of my favorites include Naked Blow, Needle, Higher and Higher, Deserted Chateau, Silent Hill, and no, I'm not talking about the horror game. And even the character select music. However, one song that seems to get played more often than anything else, with differing variations, is the Millennium Fight 2000 theme, which has not one, not two, but three different versions. One in the opening intro FMV, one in the menu, and one that plays during the final round of a battle. These versions do have differing song structures, but it's unmistakably the same theme altogether, just remixed. It's not bad, mind you, but it does get a little annoying hearing that theme over and over again, regardless of the version you hear. Anyway, the interesting thing about the soundtrack is that it also has several tracks ripped straight from the older games. There's even a Street Fighter opening theme medley that combines every opening from the series starting with SF2 all the way up to Third Strike. Pretty cool if you ask me. The sound effects, however, have taken a hit on this version, as is the case for a lot of 2D Capcom arcade ports on PS1. The PS1 version's sound quality is more compressed, making it sound a bit more muffled in comparison, especially the voice clips.
Target confirmed!
Round one, fight.
Too short!
I never really understood why a lot of PS1 fighting games tended to muffle the voices. Soul Blade does this, Tekken 3 does this, King of Fighters 99 does this, but I think Marvel vs. Capcom got it the worst with the heavy bit-crushing bullshit.
Ready! Fight!
But despite the compression, it's still serviceable and gets the job done.
Okay, wait just a damn minute. If this game has a Final Fight-esque stage and a song from said game, why isn't there a playable Final Fight character? Where's Cody? Guy? Hager? They're nowhere to be found. This just seems like a missed opportunity. Oh well, at least they rectified that in Capcom vs. SNK 2.
Now, I may have covered a lot of bases here about this game, but I'm only just getting started. The game has the usual structure of several regular fights before going on to a full-on boss fight. The game has 3 bosses, M. Bison from Street Fighter II, Geese Howard from Fatal Fury, and Akuma from Super Street Fighter II. The weird thing is, while I was capturing footage for this game, I kept getting Bison a lot in the first half of my recording sessions, but in the second half when I got EX Ryu, I got nothing but geese, except for maybe a couple of runs, but it was all geese from there. Akuma I couldn't figure out how to get to, not until I finished capturing footage for this game. Turns out, in order to face off against Akuma, you need to have over 80,000 groove points, which are located in the middle of the power gauges, in order to do so. But I couldn't be bothered to go back and try to reach that mark, not to mention I found the groove point system almost completely useless, and I couldn't figure out how it worked properly. One of the biggest problems this game suffers from is balancing issues. The first two stages in the arcade and pair match modes are pretty easy and help give you a feel for the game's mechanics, but when you reach the third stage, all bets are off because the AI can get very unpredictable. Sometimes the fight will be challenging but fair, requiring a good amount of skill. Sometimes the fight will be too easy, but other times, the AI can be utter bullshit. I initially thought this was all dependent on the characters, but I realized that's not the case because the difficulty tends to get quite random regardless of who you fight. Sometimes the regular characters will be total pushovers, but sometimes they can also pull off some cheap shots against you, giving you no breathing room to react. This seems to be a more common issue with SNK characters than Capcom characters, but even the Capcom characters aren't entirely void of this tomfoolery. One of the worst offenders of the cheap shots is Rugal. This guy was a total nightmare to fight, dishing out his Genocide Cutter, Kaiser Wave, and Reppuken, often in rapid succession, or sometimes even spamming one of those attacks over and over again, followed by constantly getting manhandled by his grapple. But the AI isn't the only one at fault for easily resorting to cheap tactics. It is very easy to spam your attacks in this game, even if you don't do it on purpose, in which you'll use the same attack when you really didn't mean to, which drops the skill counter a tad bit. Not only that, but the ratio 4 characters are incredibly broken, especially Akuma. Even if you use 2 of them in the pair match mode, which I must reiterate puts everyone at the same ratio, which is 2, you can easily breeze through the damn game with no trouble whatsoever, except for the boss fights because the ratio 4 characters do so much damage, they can clear a room in less than a minute. Moving back on the subject of boss fights, Bison is pretty tough but fair, and doesn't resort to cheap tactics. His attacks do a lot of damage, but he rarely ever spams them. However, you must be careful when fighting him, and try not to get wrecked by his psycho power. This fight takes some skill, but defeating him is pretty damn satisfying. Geese, on the other hand, is the complete opposite of that, and is a damn nightmare to fight against. You know the term SNK boss syndrome? Well, this asshole is the very definition of it. Not only does he constantly spam the same damn projectile attack at you, but he can easily overpower you in the blink of an eye, giving you absolutely no breathing room to speak of, and his attacks do so much damage, almost to insane levels, but nothing as annoying as his ultimate attack, the Raging Storm. This attack is almost impossible to avoid, with the only way to prevent getting hit by it is if you are in a position to block the attack, but there is a very slim chance you will be doing that because once the wind-up animation is done, the attack will immediately commence, and most of the time, he will execute this attack while you are jumping, since you can't block while you are in the air, leaving you completely vulnerable to it and often turning the fight on its head, where he will pull off even more bullshit tactics after that by manhandling you and pummeling you to the ground as if you were a ball of dough being pounded on a cutting board. While he isn't the hardest fighting game boss I ever faced, that still doesn't excuse him from being an annoying SNK boss that is only difficult because of broken design. If Capcom got Bison right, why couldn't they work on Geese as well? Is it just because they wanted him to stay true to the SNK boss trope? If that is the case, then that is a lousy design choice. I know this was meant to be a corner muncher considering this is an arcade game, but that doesn't make it any better and it negates any semblance of skill at all, which makes the player feel like they have no choice but to resort to cheap fucking tactics!
Okay, I need to calm down. Anyways, back to the video.
I noticed that one of the things this version gets criticized for are the loading times, which tend to happen quite often, mostly during fights after you've won a round. However, I never found this to be much of an issue, mainly because the loading times aren't really that long here, but then again, the fact that they don't bother me may have something to do with the fact that I played this version many times before I even got to play the Dreamcast version, which may be why I don't find it jarring. You know the EX characters I mentioned? Well, most of the characters in this game have EX versions of themselves too, but unlike Ryu and Iori, these EX versions are not individual characters with different animations, movesets, outfits, or quotes. Instead, they have more combos and they are a bit faster than before, but other than that, I couldn't really see or feel much of a difference compared to Evil Ryu and Orochi Iori. I didn't even use those versions of the other characters until I recorded the footage, so to me, the option to switch those characters to their EX versions felt kind of pointless.
The final verdict.
Despite the compromises made from the Dreamcast version in order to fit all onto a PS1 disc, I have to say, Capcom did a pretty good job here. It still kind of baffles me that they worked on this port and released it a full year after the PS2 version of Capcom vs SNK 2, but I'm glad this port exists. I was expecting not to enjoy it as much when I replayed it after many years, but I was pleasantly surprised by how much fun I was having, and this isn't my nostalgia talking, I genuinely enjoyed it. The gameplay is just as quick and snappy as the other versions, and though the controls may turn off some people due to the changes they had to make in order to accommodate for the engine that was used, they are very responsive and work quite well for the game that it was made for. The graphics may suffer from noticeable pixelation, but it's still pretty easy on the eyes, with varied backdrops that make proper use of the fighting that takes place, the solid character animation, and the super moves are pretty badass to watch when performed correctly. On top of that is a great soundtrack with some memorable tunes, and even some neat little throwbacks to the games of yesteryear. The game may suffer from unbalanced AI, especially with the SNK characters due to inconsistent difficulty, the loading times may be a bit of a turnoff for some, and the lack of features from the Dreamcast version may seem jarring, but even with all its cutbacks, I think it works well as a solid port despite the inferior hardware. Even on its own, the game is still rock solid fun, and I find myself going back to it a lot for that reason alone. This version has its own endearing charms that keep me coming back for more, and for all the shortcomings it has, I can easily forgive it. Capcom vs SNK Pro is not perfect, and the flaws it does have are noticeable, but I found it to be an overall solid fighting game with plenty of characters and fun gameplay that never lets up on the action. Even without the nostalgia goggles, I still enjoyed it myself, and even though I spent more money than I would like to for this game in order to get a complete copy, I feel like I got my money's worth. My final rating for Capcom vs SNK Pro on PS1 gets an 8 out of 10. I'm not sure if I would recommend this port to a lot of people considering its cutbacks from the Dreamcast version and the missing features, but if you're curious about how this version holds up, check it out. It's a bit steep in its price if you're looking for a complete copy, but if you just want to get the disc, then it shouldn't be too bad for your wallet.
And now that this review is over, it's time for me to sign off and contemplate my next review. I'm hoping to work on some stuff that isn't a fighting game, but I don't really know where to start. If you have any suggestions, feel free to drop a comment below. Please note, I can't do every game out there. That's impossible. But if I see something that interests me, I will take the time to look into it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. Take care.